I go for walks. I love seeing signs. Whenever I go for walks and there's a sign, I end up reading it. And it comes from a long history for me. I came to this country as an immigrant, as a young child. My parents loved going to tourist locales, historic sites, and museums. And it's how I learned about places, by reading signs. And so this first set of images are some heritage interpretation signs at Philippi Estate Park. And they tell of a robust heritage for Sarasota's centennial. It's all too easy when walking around a place like Philippi Estate Park and seeing that creek you see between the trees in the bottom images, and imagine nature, unchanging and eternal plants and waters. But as I'll hopefully show you today, there is so much more beneath the surface. And beneath the surface and all around us, we need to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the ancestors of the Seminole and Miccosukee peoples. And part of this process of sharing the history for Philippi Creek, the peoples who've lived by Philippi Creek, is to be and enact our responsibility to honor and respect their heritage by learning as much as possible. This talk is part of that land acknowledgement. I'm Uzi Baram, professor of anthropology at New College of Florida, and I'm really here to celebrate the robust cultural heritage by Philippi Creek. You see in the background of this first slide, a painting by Benson B. Moore, and I'll think about those issues from the past with you all. Our themes for the archaeology of Philippi Creek is one that there's history all around us when we can read the signs. The river links different epochs for Sarasota that covers thousands of years, and their partnerships built on trust works really well for our communities to bring out this robust heritage. Part of my duties at New College of Florida is the director of the New College Public Archaeology Lab, founded in 2010. I built this program in this facility to encourage New College undergraduates to get involved in local communities. And I developed this as a process of what I called radical openness, coming out of the work of the Black feminist thinker Bell Hooks, sharing all aspects of the process of research in order to make meaningful contributions to resilience and sustainability for archaeology, heritage, and our sense of community. There's so much throughout this region. There's so much to know about. And as you see in this image here on the right that comes from the Society for Historical Archaeology, I see the work of archaeology as getting information, getting belongings from ancestors at these places that are typically called archaeological sites, but are referred to as heritage locales. This new terminology of belongings and heritage locales, I think it helps us to understand that we're studying the past to better our present and imagine, well, productive futures for ourselves and our descendants. I'm not going to give you the whole story for the whole region. We're going to be focused first at Philippi Estate Park, here right by Siesta Key. I was quite lucky several years ago when the then Sarasota County archaeologist Ryan Murphy offered the opportunity to do a program of archaeology with the county, and Priscilla Brown, who you see pictured here, really jumped at the opportunity with full enthusiasm and a gracious welcome to create a program to bring out more of the information from archaeology at Philippi Estate Park. We had a deadline. 1916 was when the Edson Keith mansion was built on this property. And so we wanted a program for 2016, so now 5 years ago. And Priscilla made it clear we want to expose all the histories for the park. Ryan Murphy, the county archaeologist, labeled the endeavor Community Heritage Awareness and Management Program with the acronym CHAMP. And I was able, as you've seen some of these pictures, to integrate the undergraduates at New College of Florida into the planning, excavation, lab work, and presentations on the history recovered by archaeology. I'm going to cover a lot of history for Philippi Estate Park to start our exploration of Philippi Creek. We're going to start more than 3,000 years ago, during what archaeologists refer to as the Archaic period. We'll move to the Manasota period between 2,500 and 1,300 years ago. Then have a real giant leap to the 1770s to the 1840s. We have in the 1840s the Anglo-American period beginning, the boom times of the 1920s, and then mid-20th century dynamics. And I'll move all this history to what's been done for preservation. Sarasota County bought the property and made it into a park in 1986. Archaeologists and historians studied the property in 1988. It was put on the National Registry of Historic Places in 1991. And this program of CHAMP that I did with Sarasota County Historical Resources was 2014 to 16. So lots of numbers. And this park is about 60 acres. It sits right on the south side of Phillippi Creek at the mouth of this river that runs through Sarasota. And I'll start with this archival picture from probably in the 1930s. For those who are here, you might know that probably one of the more famous founders of modern Sarasota is Bertha Palmer. Bertha Palmer came to Sarasota and really made a tremendous difference in creating a particular type of community. Her sons, among their other endeavors, established the Sarasota Fruitville Drainage District in 1923. And part of this initiative drained roughly 26,000 acres of a slough that they did for the sake of their farms and experimental station. It ended up producing more than 50 miles of canals, and it heavily dredged Phillippi Creek. And what you see in this picture is a local realtor, J.E. Moore, who in his spare time liked to explore these canals and go up and down the river. Here he is by Phillippi Creek. He had some fame in his lifetime. And here's a newspaper story from the Sarasota Herald Trib. In 1929, he found what he thought was a human skeleton that was fossilized. He had found tremendous numbers of fossils. Really not surprising, they are all around us. As it's listed here, buffalo and tarpeds, giant sloths, bisons and mammoths, all sorts of large mammals are here in the ancient days. And he thought as well, there were ancient people here as well. The newspaper, this is from 1936, writes about this endeavor. And that find in 1929 is really remarkable. At the time, there was tremendous scholarly debate on the antiquity of the peoples of the Americas. And although it may be surprising for some of you to hear this, Florida was actually at the center of some of those debates. There had been finds in Osprey, just south of us in downtown Sarasota, at what's now historic Spanish Point. The Webb family found some skeletal remains they thought was ancient out at Old Vero Beach on the East Coast. Others also found what they thought were ancient finds of humans. And there were arguments by scholars, particularly one at the Smithsonian, that said, no, it wasn't possible. This realtor was one who argued, no, people were here from ancient days. Sadly enough, this realtor and the others lost to what I can only describe as racist thinkers in anthropology. Those who assumed that, well, the Native Americans came recently, only a little before the Europeans, and so they had no real right to the lands. Archaeologists and anthropologists changed tremendously over those years. We've kind of taken decades to catch up with those sensible people who knew the land and knew the finds. But it took really until the 1980s for the field of archaeology to recover. And here we have a newspaper story from 1982. And you see George Lohr and Marion Omi, who are tremendously important in figuring out the Native American past. I list here, because I'm an academic and I always want to have my references, some of the site reports from 1988, 1994, again in 1998, and a historical overview from 1988. I'm going to be giving the insights from the 2014-2016 project, but I'll say that everything we did with CHAMP comes out of reading Marion Omi's work. And to a great extent, if Marion recommended it or suggested it even, I just did it. And the best advice I give to other heritage managers is listen to what Marion has to say. She was right and she continues to be right. The archaeology itself, and this I'm going to be showing the heritage interpretation signs we made in 2016 and that you can find at Philippi Estate Park. The first one just tells that story about archaeology. It lays out how archaeology is a way to make sense of things that otherwise are not really noticeable. Probably the most important, what you see here, are the shells, because it's so easy to look at a shell and assume it's just a broken shell. But in the replica of the hammer and the fishing hook, in the ones that you see on top, both the plain ceramic, but the two shells were worked into tools. Sarasota County does not have places to get rocks. While other native peoples across the Americas, and like others around the world, you could use stone to make various types of hunting and cooking instruments, different types of tools. Here, people have made things out of shell, and we find those shells and we can identify them as belongings, as what archaeologists used to refer to as artifacts. And even as you see in the bottom here, the shells were used as architecture, as the foundations for buildings. And so as we look here, and one of the things I ask whenever I engage in archaeological work is to not just see the excavations, the shovel and trowel, but looking at this landscape and realizing there's more here than meets the eye. That I'm going to ask you to imagine the people who are here using the empirical evidence from archaeology. And those first people, as I stated, came during the long Archaic period. A little bit of details for you all. You see on top, it says 8SO616. The way archaeologists keep track of archaeological sites in the United States of America is through a convention that started in the mid-20th century. Every state has a number. Florida happens to be numbered number 8. There's an acronym for each county. SO is Sarasota County. And then the sites are named one after the other, And so 8SO tells me it's Sarasota County in Florida, and 616 is just when it was first recorded. And one of the things that's been found from the Archaic period are flakes, lithic flakes. As much as I said that there's not much stone around here, it seems that somehow they had some stone. And we have lots of evidence of some flaking of stones. Now, we don't have the tools they made. You can see here is some of their projectile points, otherwise known as arrowheads, that the stones were made into. And so the assumption is they came, they stayed by this creek, someone had a raw rock, they flint knapped it, they knocked it down. We have those pieces they knocked down, they made something and they used that. And this is just an example of one of the things they might have made from the Florida Museum of Natural History. As we think about that, we have so little. For the Archaic, that's all we have are those flakes. We don't have other materials. It's a very long period of time, the Archaic, thousands and thousands of years, and people lived by gathering plant foods, berries and fruits and vegetables and other such things. They hunted deer, rabbits, other animals, and they fished. They went into the waters with their nets and collected fish and shellfish. And what we have is hopefully a sense from these different views is a reminder that the flakes, those little tiny things that were found, open avenue for imagining the people of the Archaic, to think about what they might have been like. And this is just 3 examples. So we can kind of imagine not a simple world at all, but a really complicated one. The other way we try to make sense of things is by what's known as ethnoarchaeology. And here's just two examples for hunting. One on the left is one of the then new college students using what's known as an atlatl. And at the top you see a diagram with it. Bows and arrows come much later. Spears are not very effective in terms of people's ability to actually throw them. An atlatl, that piece of wood you see in the diagram, just allows a greater velocity for hunting. And luckily he's not watching. One of my kids with a throwing stick aimed at a wooden rabbit that you see there. Right, we start imagining, how did they engage in this? What kind of nets did they have? What kind of tools for hunting? What kind of tools for gathering? And that opens up all of a sense of their ways of life. And so we put a sign together for people walking around Philippi Estate Park to, one, recognize this Philippi Creek fossil and J.E. Moore's work. One of the features of the archaic, as you see on the sign, the upper right, is that there were rising sea levels. 12,000 years ago, the coast of Florida was further away from where we are sitting in, where I'm sitting in Sarasota. Basically 50 miles to the west was land. And then as the ice melted, as the ice age ended, the waters creeped up. And generation after generation, people saw rising sea levels until it started stabilizing around 6,000 years ago. And we have to kind of imagine what that world was like for these people and how much we've lost because it's now underwater. Some of you may be aware that off of Manasota Key, Archaic Period Cemetery from 8,000 years ago has been recovered by underwater archaeologists. That cemetery was on land. It's just the waters came over and over again. The sign itself, with all its text for you to look at when you go to Philippi Estate Park, tells about those changing shorelines, about those lithic flakes, about the stratigraphy, and that larger view of the archaic, of people moving around, sharing resources, ideas, and making social connections, all of which was there during that most ancient past. The most exciting parts in terms of the archaeology that we engaged in and what's most famous for, again, takes a little effort to see. And this is the Manasota period, a term that obviously comes together from the two counties, Manatee County and Sarasota County, dated between 2,500 and 1,300 years ago. This clamshell that you see has markings right at the edge, and that's wear marks for it was used on probably a hide to strip it to make it into either clothes or a covering of some kind. And this is where that archaeological imagination I mentioned before comes in. If you look really closely, you'll see there's just a bit of a rise. And that is what's known as the Prody shell midden. Here again, we see the name for the site, 8SO 617, the 617 site in Sarasota County in Florida. And this 1,200 years of history is represented by what we have left right under that tree. I had mentioned earlier that a lot of the work I do really follows in really important footsteps by George Laurer and Marion Omi. Back in 1979, as they were really just beginning their work, they laid out a description for the Manasota culture, this archaeological culture that is represented by people basically from Charlotte Harbor up to Tampa Bay starting 1,200 years ago. It's places that yield an economy based on fishing, hunting, shellfish gathering, simple undecorated pottery, shell tools, including what you see in the top of the screen for shell hammers and other such tools. Very little stone tools are found, bone tools are occasionally found and probably known, and burials, primarily flexed burials. And from this, we try to make sense of how they made a life for themselves on the shores of Philippi Creek. While we don't have any such examples here in Sarasota, I am going to point up to Pinellas County, where finds from the Manasota period of canoes have been found, particularly at Weeden Island. As we think about this most ancient past, thousands of years ago, people almost logically, almost obviously traveled by water. That's why they're living on Philippi Creek. They were going with canoes, and here we see the remains of one, both in the ground and after it was taken out of the ground, that was used so he would go up and down the coast and into the interior. We have such a possibility of recognizing how dynamic this way of life, how far-flung, how knowledgeable the people were of their place in the world and the world around them. We can imagine people, hopefully as I lay this out, people traveling by canoe, fishing and shellfishing, gathering, trading. The Prody Mound at Philippi Estate Park is there in the middle. There's also burial mounds at historic Spanish Point. There's ritual mounds in Englewood at what's known as Indian Mound Park, Polson Point. There were large-scale mound phenomenon, what's now downtown Sarasota. This was a whole world of people living for 1,200 years, a coastal adaptation that was remarkably successful. And so the heritage interpretation sign shows that map with the major sites. It shows this plain ceramic vessel that you find, the shells that they used to build up the architecture, their foundations. They have buildings on top of those foundations. We're clear this is not the name of a tribe. It's not a name of a people. It's just an archaeological convention. They had a lot in common in terms of their materiality. So we call it an archaeological culture. There's so much more we want to know. And the work of preservation, as I'll make clear, is why we know what we know. And hopefully we can do even more to reveal the life of these people from 2,500 years ago. Well, although there's still activities around the region, we don't have any evidence at Philippi Estate Park for what happens after the Manasota period. It may be that people are just living in places that are now inundated, so that's underwater now. It may be they just went to the villages that were nearby and only traveled lightly over this area. The lives continued. The Calusa developed in Charlotte Harbor, the Tocumbaga developed in Tampa Bay, and then the Spanish come. And as John Worth's book, Discovering Florida, shows in this very nicely made map, all those Spanish expeditions ignored Philippi Creek. They just went right up the coast as quickly as they could to Tampa Bay, and as some of you know, went on to conquer and destroy the ways of life for the indigenous people, although many, many survived and continue to survive to this day. The next time that we find a sense of history and people takes us all the way to the 1770s, when fisher folk from Havana, looking for new areas for fishing, for fish, start coming to the Gulf Coast of Florida and create an industry that's known as the Cuban fishing ranchos. These started as seasonal fishing camps where a few people would come, catch the rich fish resources of the bay and the Gulf, dry and salt the fish, and then return in the spring to Havana to sell the fish for the world market. The Spanish Empire, of course, was a Catholic empire, and so particularly for Lent, it was important to have all that fish. It was so wildly successful that those seasonal hamlets became year-round communities. They started becoming a source of tremendous wealth for some of the people who engaged in this Cuban fishing rancho endeavor. One of them was Philippi. And we have just the shadows of his life. Philippi Creek, of course, is named for him. And you can see in this map from 1847 that he had his rancho up there in Sarasota Bay. And in the map, he was the furthest south of the people who lived in what's now Sarasota. So the creek gets named after him. This continues. He seemed to have not been there in 1847, but he returned in what's seen in an 1856 map. And that also kind of tracks that as a fisherman, he probably went wherever the fish was. This was an intensive industry, so probably when the fish stocks in one spot were just overrun, just go somewhere else and then return at different points. I will spend a little time with him because I think he's a fascinating individual. And I also think it just really connects and becomes a hinge between that most ancient past for Native Americans and contemporary Sarasota. This period in the 19th century is really the crucial one. The Florida frontier becomes the territory and ultimately the state. And the people who are the bridge between that previous way of life and the one that Birth of Harmer creates is people like Philippe. There's several different spellings of his name, and Schenck, the longtime Sarasota County historian back at the beginning of the century, wrote about Philippe, noting that in 1850 he's aged at 45 and that he was born in Spain. My sense is that's incorrect, he wanted to be Spanish rather than Cuban, and he was probably older than this. The last time we read about him, and it's a fascinating piece of the archival record, is 1858 when his third wife, Polly, is given the choice to stay in Florida with him or go with the Seminoles on the Trail of Tears. And Polly chooses to go to Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma, leaving Philippe in Sarasota. And that's the last time we hear of him. It's important because that line that we have today between these Cuban fishermen and the Seminole peoples was much more blurry and much more fluid. That many of the people who lived at these ranchos were Native Americans, some identified as Seminole, some identified as Spanish Indians, some identified as Cubans. And during this period of the Trail of Tears, made choices of how they would identify. Philippe opted to get a European identity as Spanish. Polly ended up choosing to go with Native Americans. Miranda Omi, the daughter of Marion Omi, lays out what I think is probably the appropriate timeline around 1820, while it's still Spanish Florida. He sets up a rancho. He ends up, when the US claims Florida in 1821, becoming part of a rancho of William Bunce, who comes from Maryland to join this fishing industry for Havana, and his name gets anglicized from Philippe. We know a bit more about him because the founding of the village of Manatee in 1841 is thanks to Philippe, Miguel, and Manuel, these discussed in the archival record as three Cuban fishermen who helped guide Josiah Gates to the place on the Manatee River. Some of you know that part of my scholarly work in the region has been on the Angola community, the maroon community from the late 1800s, the late 1700s, to early 1800s. This place at Manatee Mineral Spring was where Angola was. And so Philippe is part of that story. He knows about this community of Maroons. How that was connected, we're still trying to work through. He spends time with Josiah Gates's family, as the historian Janet Snyder Matthew notes in her 1983 book, Edge of Wilderness. The Gates children called him Uncle Philippi. And he is very much part of this new Anglo-American Florida. Well, it's not just that he's interesting in terms of my sense of where the name Philippi Creek comes from, but it's also that his rancho is a crucial moment in the wars against the Seminoles. For the Seminole people, there was a long 19th century war. In US military records, there's three wars. The First Seminole War, 1816 to 1818, the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, and then the Third Seminole War in 1855 to 58. The Seminoles put forward correctly that they were never conquered, that they've always been able to live free. And this was a series of wars all through the 19th century that tried to take the land from them. We're going to look at that middle part. The Second Seminole War was horrific for the peoples of Florida and for the US military. When it ends, it's basically the US government just saying enough is enough. But then something happens. 1849, the Anglo-American settlements like at Manatee, at Sarasota, and so many other places are growing, becoming a little more productive. And then July 12th, 1849, 4 men attack a farm on the Indian River on the east coast of Florida, killing 1 man and wounding a man and a woman. And this caused fear among the Anglo-Americans of the East Coast and of the West Coast. Many around this part of Indian River fled to St. Augustine. And then of those 4 men, they attacked again at Charlotte Harbor, at the Kennedy and Darling store on what sometimes referred to as the P River, but we know as the Peace River. It looked like another Seminole War would rise up. Here's some of the people involved. Captain John Casey, you know his name from Casey Key. John Gibbon, a U.S. career military officer. General David Twiggs, who you see in the picture. A fellow sometimes known as Samson or Simon, I'm not quite sure why 2 different names, who was a translator for the U.S. military of African descent. Sam Jones of Anaka, and Billy Bowlegs, Lata Mutko, who you see here in the image from 1858. In the middle, I have an image of what one of the ranchos would have looked like, thatched covered building. The U.S. military was gearing up for war against the Seminoles after the murders on the Indian River and the attack on the store on the Peace River. John Casey went down and visited Sarasota Bay looking for the Seminoles, looking for Billy Bowlegs. And he reported going to Philippe's house and finding, this is a quote from the military record, a snow white flag about 6 inches square made by attaching heron's feathers to a stick. On top of the low staff was fashioned a small stick of white beads and twist of tobacco. And there were markings on the house next to this indicating requesting a meeting for the next full moon. What you see is a replica some of my students made for this project. Simon is the one who translated this, and John Casey argued, and here's the original letter found in the archives, saying, please let me go and negotiate. And so John Casey goes, and this is from Jan Snyder Matthews' 1983 book, a nice representation, lands, there you see an image of the hut, and meets with Billy Bowlegs. And Bowlegs asks John Casey if the U.S. military will stop and wait. That while he recognized it was 4 Seminole men who committed those murders and attacked the store, it was not acting for the Seminoles. They did not want this to be the case. And that he promised to bring those 4 to justice if the U.S. military would give them the time. These 2 men had a lot of trust. There were arguments among the Seminoles of what to do, particularly between strategies by Billy Bowlegs and Sam Jones. Here you see Sam Jones in a statue at Atatiki on the Seminole Reservation, and a nice painting of Billy Bowlegs, how to deal with this location and dispossession of land. Billy Bowlegs trusted John Casey, and John Casey trusted Billy Bowlegs. And although it's gruesome to relate, this was a particularly challenging time, Billy Bowlegs returned and showed John Casey the scalp of one of the Seminoles who had done the murders, brought another one and said the other 2 had been killed as well. John Casey accepted that, told the commanding officers, his commanding officers at Fort Brooke in Tampa, that the murderers had been brought to justice and the uneasy peace was kept. I put this story on this heritage sign for Philippi Creek because I think this is just a tremendously important moment in the history of our region, that Philippe is this bridge between the Spanish period and the Anglo-American period, the territorial period for Florida. It reminds us the continuing importance of fishing, just like it was during the Manasota period. That's why people are here to fish and use those resources. And then even in this colonial situation, these 2 men trusted each other and were able to arrive at an agreement that kept the peace for a few more years. Sadly, it didn't stay as peaceful, but we start moving into the more recent past for Philippi Estate Park. And again, the archaeology gives us some objects, and these start looking more familiar, unlike the shell tools, unlike the pieces of pottery, unlike the flakes. Here you see half of a ceramic cat toy, a cartridge from a bullet, some ceramics, a glass bottle. Right? These are all quite familiar as historic materials from the Edson Keith house. Again, we have that numbering system 8SO618. We have some historic maps for Philippi Creek. Philippi Estate Park, again, is right there in that corner, where just above where it says Eagles, and right under where it says Drum Right. The numbers that you see are the soundings. A ship went and just measured how deep the water was. And you can see it's actually quite shallow throughout this whole region. The important piece here is this identification of W.J. Drumright, a farmer and a beekeeper who acquired 40 acres by Philippi Creek in 1883. He ended up creating a stable, a smokehouse, gardens, groves in this area. A later map, and even more impressive, shows Philippi Creek, shows Siesta Key, and what's known at the mouth of the creek as the mangroves. So it was not, at this point in history, an easy place to travel up because of all the growth of the mangroves. 1810, that land is sold and dredging begins in Sarasota Bay. There's a scheme to create housing development, Philippi Park. It ends up lots of bought by Mabel Lynn of Chicago. She starts doing construction, but decides to sell much of the land, many of the lots, in 1915 to Edson Keith. And in 1916, Edson, who had married Nettie in 1891, builds what was then just a magnificently large mansion right on Philippi Creek. That's what you see behind the building. Here you see the plan for this two-story building. Today, I think it's seen as kind of a small mansion. At its time, it was seen as really large. And this really made a statement about the future of Sarasota, just like the other people that we know of from Sarasota, the Ringlings, Bertha Palmer, and others. Edson Keith and Netti Keith are part of that history. From them, we know so much more. They lived across Philippi Creek from the sons of Bertha Palmer. There you see one of the images of her, and then you see one of her sons, Honore, and of course his name is given to one of the major north-south roads in Sarasota County. We see the views. The Keith home, excuse the cartoons, I figured this was a good point of the talk to have something a little cute in it. It wasn't just a winter residence, this was a permanent home. They had servants, they had outbuildings, they tried to create a self-sustaining estate. They had wide lawns, they had ornamental plantings, a rose garden, but also vegetable gardens, a citrus grove, fields for hay and fodder. They had chickens, cows, sheep. They tried to be self-sustaining on this land. Here we see a picture of Nettie with her son Frederick on the dock as their life, like the previous people, just like for Philippe, just like for the Manasota period, just like for the Archaic period, people living right on the water, enjoying Philippi Creek. Here we see the garage and the servants' quarter from 1935. We see the Keith's car sometime in the early 1920s. The Tamiami Trail gets built starting in 1928, and the park is right off of the Tamiami Trail, making for easy access. And so this heritage interpretation sign focuses on the Keiths, their lives, their children, some of those materials. We tell of how Sarasota develops through the creation of this estate. I'll say in a few moments about the other images you see here. After Edson Keith dies, Nettie stays and she ends up selling the house, the mansion, the property in 1942. Another Chicagoite comes, May Hanson Prody, to buy this land. She's famous for coming up with the concept of a wardrobe for Barbie dolls. This is just a fantastic little detail. They're coming up with these dresses for Barbies made her quite rich. Her husband, it's always referred to and a husband in the historical record, was an executive with Walgreens. They end up taking the mansion and turning it into Philippi Plantation Restaurant and Inn, where they served people meals and had guest rooms. The Sarasota Herald Tribune in the 1950s has the advertising for Philippi Plantation on the South Trail, where you enjoy the casual atmosphere of informal Southern hospitality combined with superb food, superior service, excellent cocktails, dinners from $2. And there you see some of the entrees available as well as their prices. And that's open until midnight. This was, I guess, the happening place in Sarasota, what's now Philippi Estate Park. In the 1960s, these are photographs courtesy of Patty Gross, who happened to have been the graphic designer for those heritage interpretation signs. It seems there was an artist colony that grew out of that inn, and Patty Gross decided to show these images that really I take to be almost too evocative of that romantic image of the 1960s and just enjoyment. 1986, Purdy decides to sell the property, and there's a referendum, and the people of Sarasota County decide to purchase the land to make into a park rather than see a development on it. And so it becomes a park for all of us to enjoy since that time. Historians and the park manager work in getting National Registry of Historic Places applications and put forward this with the archaeological information, the historic information. In 1991, it was accepted to be on National Registry of Historic Places. And then to just kind of bring it back to the beginning, in January 2016, there you see me with a baseball cap. The other baseball cap is Steve Koski, the current Sarasota County archaeologist. The people in the blue t-shirts are new college students. The fellow with the gray t-shirt with the cap on is Ryan Murphy, the one who helped me start this process going. Here we are at New College by the New College Public Archaeology Lab, where very happy students are washing those belongings from Philippi Estate Park. And here you see other students engaged in the interpretation of the property using those heritage interpretation signs, and I guess making funny faces for the camera. And then I been giving talks at the park to kind of convey a sense of this history and encourage people to read these signs. And as I've been trying to do during this presentation, not just read them, but really imagine the people living. You can see just behind the students, Philippi Creek being on that water, going in with nets, as you see in this image, and collecting the fish and having a feast. Well, there's a lot at this property. Here's just the GIS version of Philippi Estate Park with the Manasota Mound, the materials that were found from the Edson Keith mansion, the small historic materials that were just thrown into the river, the Lithic scatter, that's part of the archaic, the historic sites on the other side of the river. But this is just a small piece. That Philippi River, as this says, Philippi Creek, as it's better known, to its west were the mangroves, now cleared off to get, so you no longer can just walk over to Siesta Key. But then we go upriver and we start exploring what else is here. And we have, is also quite fantastic. I know I lived in Sarasota for quite a few years before I recognized Philippi Creek. Unlike our east-west grid, it goes from the southwest to the northeast. And so the blue arrows just point out the places of Philippi Creek running through Sarasota, and not just water running through Sarasota, but as hopefully I can convey a sense of the history that runs through Sarasota, because people can go from that mouth of Philippi Creek upriver, as we know they must have done during the Archaic, during the Manasota, during the Cuban rancho period, and today in kayaks. Here we can see the 7.2 mile river, a little clearer through this drawing to give a sense of it. And so we're going beyond Philippi Estate Park to really think about what's here. And so I'm just giving you a little taste of it. One of the places where we have water that's part of the drainage for Philippi Creek is the Celery Fields. Right, today, a place with a large reservoir for water for the heavy rains, and a hill that came out of that from the Borrow Pit, to use that archaeological term, which is a major tourist attraction. Before this was built, Philippi Creek regularly flooded and was a challenge for the people who lived near the river. Since the Celery Fields was built, and of course it was called Celery Fields because they grew celery in the beginning of the 20th century, and that name has kind of just stuck. There's no longer that danger of flooding. It seems to have done really well, including during Hurricane Irma that dumped a lot of rain on us back in 2017. And so we have this as one of the beginnings for Philippi Creek. The river runs through Pinecraft, the Amish Mennonite community that you see pictured here, Pinecraft Park, right off of the main part of Bay of Vista where Pinecraft is. This way you can walk by the river and kayak off of it. One of the major high schools in Sarasota is Riverview. And of course, the river that we refer to in Riverview is Philippi Creek. Right, there's a lot there. And what I'm not doing, because I'm conscious of time, but I also want to really intrigue you all, is as much as I was able to tell you about the Archaic, the Manasota, the Cuban ranching period, early Sarasota history for Philippi Estate Park, that history goes up and down Philippi Creek. It's not limited just to where we did the excavations. Where we go back to J.E. Moore, here you see pictured in a newspaper story in 1956. As I've said, I think he was right. The fossil that he found, or the human remains he found in 1929, we don't quite know how this happened in its details, but he took it, boxed it up, put it in the mail, and sent it to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And John McCarthy, the longtime manager for Parks and Rec in Sarasota, now head of VP of Historic Spanish Point for Selby Gardens, tried to track it down. I tried to track it down. I asked one of my colleagues who lives in New York City to try to track. The American Museum of Natural History has no record of this skeleton. So we're going to just keep this as a mystery. But in the newspaper story from 1956, you can see his cabinets. And while I would dissuade any of you from collecting belongings and putting them in your house, you can see just the richness of the amount of things he found going up and down that creek. There's still so much more we need to learn and can learn about the ancestors of the Seminole and Miccosukee people that run through Sarasota. We do know, and this is again bringing it back, at All Vero Beach, it turns out that was ancient. At Little Salt Spring and Warm Mineral Springs in Northport, we do know there's ancient humans. People were here at least 14,000 years ago, probably 20,000 years ago. Whether they fossilized or not is a whole different set of questions. That they hunted mastodons and mammoths is not a question anymore. We know the ancestors were here for tens of thousands of years. And so as we look at all this, right, I tend to ask this as a question, right? Who lived by Philippi Creek? Well, we know very ancient humans. How ancient? Well, maybe very, very ancient, maybe 20,000 years. During the Archaic period, we know there were Native Americans making their living here, settling the land, pioneers, and those are the ancestors of the Seminole and Miccosukee people, as were the most ancient people. They were Manasota people with their coastal adaptation, the Cuban fisher folks, those Anglo-Americans who came of the leisure class, Bertha Palmer, the Keiths, and their servants. And I always want to say, and us as well, right? You all, including myself. I'm doing this lecture from home within sight of one of the canals from Philippi Creek. It'll take me just a few moments to walk across the nature preserve to get to Philippi Creek. This is very much centered and centers Sarasota in this rich history, centers hopefully a sense of not just the centennial, but the thousands of years of heritage. For those who like numbers, here's some of those dates that give us a sense of what we have. And some of the materials that have been found around Sarasota, some of the belongings from antler with markings to show the menstrual cycle, to a face of someone carved into stone, to a hammer shell, to a pot. And as we go through this, realize, and that's the image on the bottom left, we're stressed about time. In the Archaic period, the sea levels rose, and this Anthropocene time, the sea levels are rising, and many of these coastal sites are going to get inundated. And the information that's there, unless we do something, will get lost. And so we're in a race with time with what to collect, what to find out, and what will get washed away. I'm hoping this intrigued you, and so I'm going to encourage you to do more. There's a nice website for Phillippi Creek, phillippicreek.org. I'm a member of Time Sifters Archaeology Society that has monthly presentations and a website with recordings of previous presentations. I'm still director at the New College Public Archaeology Lab, and now that the pandemic is ending, hopefully have more activities at the New College campus in the coming academic year. This is sponsored by the library, so I want to give a shout out to the library. They have tremendous books, resources to read about all this, and under the library is also historical resources that helps collect, preserve, and protect our county's heritage. And for Philippi Estate Park itself, in the middle there, Florida Humanities Council created a walking tour. So you can go, if you have a smartphone, find the app for walking tours, and you can walk and hear some of this as you walk through it and read those signs. There's a lot at Philippi Estate Park, and there's a lot in Sarasota. And so my last word is just to show you my kind of next project that's live, but not quite ready. In trying to get people excited and knowledgeable about this long history and rich heritage, Florida Humanities Council has provided some funding through Time Sifters Archaeological Society for a website. And this is all on me. In terms of doing this, I decided to take Charles Ringling and make him a tour guide for the history of Sarasota, Manatee. And as you see here listed, Charles helps us see the Paleo-Indian period, the Archaic period, the Manasota period that I talked about, the Spanish period, the Cuban rancho period, the Seminoles, all the way to Newtown and when the Ringlings came themselves. So it's not quite ready, but it is live for you to look at, and hopefully this as well will get you excited to help us preserve, just like those Sarasota residents in the 1980s preserved the park, to preserve this history so that we can ensure that our children and grandchildren can know about this robust heritage. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation on Philippi Creek.
Thank you, Uzi, for presenting this, bringing this information forward. Philippi Creek's always been one of my favorite parks, and it's nice to know that there's a rich history there. We do have a couple questions in there. We have Bruce asking, how much wider and longer was the creek during Manasota period?
That's a good question. And I think the answer to it is that the flooding that was going on until then, I think early 1990s, meant that it moved around a bunch. And one of the things I've tried to work with hydrologists is try to make sense of the rivers around here and how much they actually moved around. And so it's a really good question, and I don't have the answer for it. Sorry to say.
Let's go one more. It says, are there any archaeological digs going on now? And if so, how do we get involved with them?
So one of the things that the pandemic did was to really close off a lot of public engagements, right? That with COVID-19, there just was an urge to bring people together. There's two organizations which have possibilities for volunteers. One is Time Sifters Archaeology Society, and that's who I work with. So when I do my projects, I of course invite new college students because I'm a professor there, so I have easy access to them. And then I give a call out to Time Sifters Archaeology Society to see if there's community members who want to join. And over the years, including the work at Philippi Estate Park, Time Sifters volunteers and members show up. and help out. So if you're interested, I may be involved in a project this summer. I know it's already May, up at DeSoto National Memorial. The logistics aren't quite there. But if I do, it'll be announced by Time Sifters if we need volunteers. The other organization is statewide, the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and there's a branch of it in Tampa. They have lots of different types of programmings, many hands-on. So also look at the Florida Public Archaeology Network.
I'd also like to mention that the Selby Library partners with Time Sifters as well. So, and I do have those programs scheduled to be in the auditorium next year. We're crossing our fingers that we can resume face-to-face programming. But and I know you typically provide a lecture through that series as well. Anybody else have any questions out there?
I like the comment about no idea them. Yeah, there's so much here. It's just, I think, part of the task is how do we share that information? And that's why I think the county library system has just been fantastic as a resource to both get out current endeavors, but also have all those resources and historical resources. And there's a lot of the books I mentioned, as well as those old newspapers.
I live on near Pinecraft Park, Messakamik, and has there been any archaeological digs there at all?
There's been just a couple of projects, and they were done mostly by George Laurer in the 1980s. And so I can say that, that the comment I made in terms of the Archaic and Manasota period, that comes out of Dr. George Laurer's work. I have not mapped that out, but I think that's going to be one of the projects that's forthcoming, is kind of showing where some of those are. Sadly, most of those were noted, documented, and there's housing over them now. Thank you for your kind words.
We have any more questions? Any last questions before we let Uzi go?
All right, like that's it. Thank you so much, Brian, for this opportunity, and thank you, Ellen.
It's good to see you again. We'll see you in the flesh someday.
Great program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Excellent. Yeah, let me know when you get a recording up.
Yeah, it's recorded, and I just have to edit it automatically transcribes, but that transcription is not always up to par. So
my accent is still a little challenging for technology.
Well, no, but you use some big words too, so those big words will need to be transcribed.
I am an academic, I can't help it. Again, thank you both. I really appreciate all the support and the interest.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you very much, sir.
Be well.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Susie. Take care.